I went to an awful college that will not be named. No one should ever go to that college. It's an awful place. It's an awful institution. I was not happy there. It is a glorified summer camp. And I mean, a lot of good professors there, but the actual academic institution is horrendous. I went to this awful college in Ohio. But one of the things that my awful college in Ohio did was they had this course that you had to take, and it was LAS 150, Liberal Arts and Sciences 150. And it was a course that everyone had to take. Didn't matter what your major was. You majored in business, you majored in biology, you majored in sports medicine, you majored in economics. No matter who you are, everyone was required to take LAS 150. And it was this course that was supposed to help you learn to think like a sophisticated college person, right? It was Liberal Arts and Sciences 150. And the college printed their own textbook for this course. Everyone had to take LAS 150. And the college wrote their own textbook for LAS 150. It was assembled by the faculty. And they had writings by important thinkers throughout history, the writings from Plato and writings from Immanuel Kant and writings from, Thomas Jefferson. And, it was all this, all of this, the important thinkers, right? Anyway, in LAS 150, they had two passages from Karl Marx, because Marx is an important thinker. So they had two passages from Karl Marx. One of them was a passage from the German Ideology. The German Ideology is an early philosophical book by Karl Marx. It's about refuting German idealism. It's not about communism. It has nothing. It's about philosophy, right? It's when Marx is, in his early Marx, he's talking philosophy. Later, he's talking politics. And then in his final years, he's focused on economics. This is early Marx when he's the young left Hegelian. He's arguing for materialism against idealism. That's what it is. It's the early Marx. So our assignment, the way it would work is we would have to read the passage. And then the next day we would come to LAS 150 class. And we would have to discuss it. So I remember I took LAS 150. We were assigned to read this passage from the German Ideology about how do you determine what is true, and nothing to do with communism. It's just philosophy, right? So we come into the class, and I'm in this class, and it's, sports and business majors, sports medicine majors, and business majors, biology majors, and education majors, and all kinds of people. We're sitting in this class, and we're assigned to read this passage from the German Ideology. So the professor is up in front of the class, and he's like, all right, what did people learn from the German Ideology? What did people learn from it? This girl raises her hand. I thought the part where he said that everyone should get paid the exact same wage, no matter how hard they work. I didn't agree with that. I think you should get paid more money if you work hard. Other student raises your hand. The part where he says we should have a brutal dictatorship to make sure that everyone's equal. I didn't agree with that. I believe in freedom. And I sat there and I'm like, are you fucking kidding me? These kids didn't read the piece. They didn't read it. And they just assumed because it's written by Karl Marx, Karl Marx is this stupid guy who thought everyone should get paid the same. You have to be retarded to believe in communism. I mean, it was infuriating to me. And the worst part was the professor just went right along with it. I'm sorry, but it's maybe there's part of me that's rigid and authoritarian, but the professor should have stepped in and gone, what page was that on, Johnny? Yeah, what page was that on, Susie? Tell me the passage that you didn't agree with. They didn't read it, right? They just assumed they had this caricature in their head of what Marxism was, right? They had this caricature of what Marxism is, right? And the professor just went along with it. It just went right along with it. Just thought, what the heck? I guess, thank God I don't have to be a college professor, right? Thank God that I don't have to be a teacher or a college professor and have situations like that. Maybe I would just go along with it, right? Maybe you learn after a while that you got to pick your battles. But no, the professor read it. And I was just like, are you shitting me? I was sitting there. I'm like, this is I couldn't believe it. Right. And that's just, but that's the crazy thing is that's what most people do. That's even what BreadTube does. Right. BreadTube They think socialism is a worker cooperative scheme. They think it's an employee stock ownership program. They must never have read Marx because, socialism, utopian, and scientific, the Communist Manifesto pretty clearly means we're abolishing the anarchy of production, state central plan. It doesn't mean you start a pencil factory with your friends, but BreadTube's never read it either, right? I mean, it's like everyone has this caricature in their head of what Marxism is, and it ain't that. It ain't that, right? I mean, Marxism, dialectical materialism, right? I mean, so many people told me they knew all about communism. They'd read Marx. They understood communism. And yeah, Tyler says that's absolutely how. Show me that page, Johnny. Let's read it together. Exactly. I was like, are you shitting me? Right. But yeah, like, maybe I don't know. Good for you, Tyler. But yeah, like, everyone has this caricature in their head of what Marxism is, right? And the phrase dialectical materialism. I had many people explain to me they knew all about Marxism. They'd studied Marx. They knew Marx. And then I would say, okay, what do you think of dialectical materialism? And they'd say, what? And it's like, how can you not know what Marxism is? And you know all about Marxism, but you've never heard of dialectical materialism. That is like the entire basis. Marx was talking about dialectical materialism before he was talking about communism, right? Before Marx was a communist, he was a dialectical materialist, right? That was the basis of the whole thing, right? Marx was a young philosophy student who got into, developed dialectical materialism. From that, he developed communism. And from that, he developed, economic theories, right? It was, this is Marx's life. And it's funny because in academia, they have this narrative where like the early Marx goes against the late Marx, right? I don't know all the details about all of that, but that's academia has worked really, really hard. And that's part of their narrative is like, well, Marx changed his views. Young Marx thought this, old Marx thought that. And I've heard some classic Marxists say that's malarkey. There's some people who argue that there's the philosophical Marx versus the academic Marx. This is what I will say about Karl Marx. This is one thing that must be said about Karl Marx, is that Karl Marx was an activist. And that gets obscured. There's like the movie about the life of Karl Marx. You would think that Karl Marx sat around writing books all the time. That is not the truth. And the anime about Marx, the anime about Karl Marx that a good friend of mine showed me is better. There's a Chinese like anime film about Marx. It's a little bit better on this front. Karl Marx was not this ivory tower intellectual. That's what people think, right? The way the biographies of Marx are written, you would think that Karl Marx sat around writing books all the time. Well, Karl Marx did write books, yes. And Karl Marx he wrote for newspapers, he wrote books and all of that. But everything that Karl Marx wrote was considered to be a boost or an aid to activism, right? Karl Marx's entire life was a life of struggle and organizing and protest. And his writing was done to clarify and give guidance to actual activism, right? For example, right? 1848, the German Revolution. That was an armed conflict. That was a war. People died in the German Revolution. And in the German Revolution, the Communist League was one of the armed factions. Karl Marx's group that he wrote the Communist Manifesto to be their statement of principles, they were an actual armed group that participated in the German Revolution of 1848. They were one of the armed factions that was rising up, fighting under the demand of creating a modern German nation state. There were nationalist factions, there were Catholic, Protestant and Anabaptist factions, and there was the Communist League, and Karl Marx was the leader of it, and he was participating in armed violent uprising. Marx was on the barricades. Marx carried a gun and shot a gun and was in armed conflict. That's activism. After Marx fled to Germany, or after he fled Germany, even when he was living in London, right? When he was living in London, we always hear about him going to the British Museum, how he was poor all the time. They were always out of money. Karl Marx went to the British Museum and he sat in the waiting room of the British Museum to get statistics and data with which to write capital. But what they don't tell you about is that he was constantly leading protests and strikes by workers, and that his International Working Men's Association, they were on the picket lines and they were striking and protesting and marching. And Karl Marx was the leader of the International Working Men's Association. So he was on the picket lines and he was meeting with the leaders of labor unions and the leaders of protest groups, and he was organizing with them and coordinating with them. So Marx was doing that. You know, Marx's daughter, Jenny Marx, she got heavily involved in support for the Irish people, and they protested against the executions of Irish people, right? They were executing Irish freedom fighters in London. They would hang Irish freedom fighters, and Jenny Marx would protest the execution of Irish freedom fighters. And even though she was of Jewish heritage from an atheist family, she wore a crucifix around her neck everywhere she went to support the Irish people who were Roman Catholic. Karl Marx organized rallies in London to support Abraham Lincoln and to oppose slavery. Mass meetings against slavery were held, where Karl Marx was a speaker, and Karl Marx helped organize those mass meetings in support of the Union Army and against slavery. Karl Marx's only job that he ever had, he only ever had 2 jobs in his life. He briefly worked for a railroad, and he got fired because his handwriting was too sloppy. And after that, his only other job was he worked for the New York Tribune, which was the Republican Party newspaper of New York City. And he wrote, London correspondence for a Republican newspaper. Karl Marx organized support for the Paris Commune. When the workers of Paris rose up and had the Paris Commune, Karl Marx was organizing rallies of the labor unions and the progressive forces, rallying to support the Paris Commune of 1871. I mean, Marx was an activist his whole life. He was engaged in struggle, and Marx's writing, his writing on philosophy, was teaching people how to understand the world. The old feudal system that's being propped up by the Catholic Church is being overthrown. So he's coming out, he's teaching people a new way of thinking that's based in dialectical materialism. And then in 1848, as the German Revolution is breaking out, he's built his own revolutionary armed group called the Communist League that's part of the uprising. They're part of the revolt, and he has to flee the country. He has to flee Germany because he's been part of this armed revolution that fails, right? He's living in Paris, right? His pamphlet, The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, one of his most important pamphlets. It's an agitational pamphlet, and it's written because he was in the middle of strikes and protests, and there was a military coup by Napoleon's nephew, Louis Bonaparte, who becomes the military dictator, the emperor of France. And there's workers' strikes, and there's the lumpen, the Society of December 10th, and the lumpen mobs are out there. Karl Marx was in the middle of all of that. And Karl Marx in London, he's the leader of the International Working Men's Association, organizing solidarity and protests in support of Ireland, organizing solidarity and protests in support of the struggle against slavery, on the picket lines with striking workers. Karl Marx was an organizer. He was an activist. He was not an academic, right? Karl Marx was never a college professor. He went to college. He studied in university. Karl Marx was not a college professor. Karl Marx was not this pointy-headed intellectual who just sat around writing books. He did write books. He did a huge amount of research, and he spent a lot of time sitting in the waiting room of the British Museum, and he spent a lot of money. He ran out of money constantly because he was going to the British Museum to get data. You couldn't Google things back then, so all the statistics and data and information was being held at the British Museum, and that's why where he was spending all his money to go get it so he could write Capital and other things. But the idea that Karl Marx was this dude who sat around writing books, it's just not true. Karl Marx was a revolutionary organizer and an activist. And that gets obscured. They don't want you to know about that Marx. They want you to know about Marx, the writer, Marx, the thinker, and all of that. But you don't understand Marx if you don't understand this, right? If you don't have that proper context for Marx, you don't understand Marx. Right? And I will say this is a piece of wisdom that I've taken from Sam Marcy. This is Marcyism. Sam Marcy would rant about this. I've seen video of Sam Marcy, videotapes where Sam Marcy would make this point. But if you're not involved in organizing, trying to build socialist and communist organizations, trying to build coalitions with people, if you're not in struggle you really don't understand Marxism. You really don't, right? Because the whole premise of Marxism is that history is driven forward by contradiction, by struggle, the dialectic, right? Historical materialism, opposing class forces. And Marx makes a lot more sense to you if you are involved in revolutionary organizing, right? If you're not involved in revolutionary organizing, if you view this in an abstract way, it's just some interesting theories, it's confusing to you. When I first opened Marx, I expected I was going to get a blueprint of an ideal communist society, and you will not find that in Marx. You won't. Marx doesn't actually talk that much about communism. I mean, he talks about class struggle, he talks about it, but in terms of what the ideal communist world will look like, he doesn't really say that much about it. In his economic manuscripts, he touches on it a little bit. And in the Critique of the Goethe Program, he explains the material basis for it. But Marx spent his life as an organizer. He was a labor organizer. He was a fighter for democratic rights against feudalism. He was an anti-slavery organizer. He was a builder of international solidarity with Ireland and with, the struggle against slavery in the United States. Karl Marx was an organizer. And if you are involved in revolutionary organizing, and if you're part of a communist organization, when you read Karl Marx's writing, it's like reading it with a magical glasses on. It makes more sense to you. It sounds completely different. The words make more sense because it matches your lived experience. Marx is meant to be read by those who read it in struggle. And I'll tell you, this is a really common experience. At university, they'll teach Marxism, usually in the philosophy department. They will teach Marxism. And a lot of young people that are interested in revolutionary ideas will take that course, and the course will suck. And they'll be like, what the hell is this course? Because it's taught by somebody who's not an activist. It's taught by someone who's not in a communist group. It's taught by someone who's not involved in the struggle. And because they're not involved in the struggle, the Marx doesn't make any sense to them. They don't understand it, right? You can't understand Marx if you're not involved in the struggle yourself, right? And this sounds bizarre. I know this sounds weird. It sounds like Caleb's saying it's magical. Like if you're involved in a struggle, suddenly Marx, the words are different or something. They're not different. But when you're actually involved in revolutionary organizing, Marx and the words that he writes strike you in a completely different manner. You have an understanding of what he's saying that you can only get through lived experience. This is what Mao is talking about in his essay, Where Do Correct Ideas Come From correct practical experience, right? You cannot learn Marxism. You cannot relate to what Karl Marx is saying correctly. And you cannot really digest what he's saying if you are not an activist. If you're not in a communist organization, if you're not, working with comrades, if you're not trying to agitate and propagate, if you're not trying to build networks and communities of solidarity and resistance, reading Marx doesn't sound the same. It's not the same, right? And this sounds very idealist. This sounds almost spiritual, but I mean, it's the truth. I mean, and it's not just Marx. There are other things in life, When I tried to read The Grapes of Wrath in high school, I was like, what the fuck is this? And then when I was in college, after the great financial crisis and after I was involved in protests in support of labor unions, I read The Grapes of Wrath and I was like, oh, wow, it struck me completely different, right? And that often a lot of things that you read or movies that you see or songs or speeches that you hear, it's in the eye of the beholder. You take with you your own preconceived notions, your own life experiences, right? You take that with you, right? So if you are actually involved in revolutionary organizing, when you read Marx, you get so much more out of it. It has so much more of a meaning for you. And if you just read it in the abstract, like you might read a philosophical book by Immanuel Kant, or you might read Nietzsche, and it's like Marx is just this famous philosopher. Marx is just this intellectual. It's like, who am I going to read this week? Who did my professor assign you to read? You're not really getting Marx. You're not really getting Marx. Marx is meant to be read by people who are living a life like Karl Marx led, a life of struggle, people that have comrades, people that are in a revolutionary organization. And if you read it in that context, it strikes you in a completely different way. And that's why the bread tube people can't understand Marxism. They cannot. You watch their videos on it. They're cringe. They're embarrassing. Right? I mean, some of these videos where they're trying to explain what Marx meant, they don't know what he meant. These people have never been organizers. They're just, farting on the internet. They're just, making YouTube videos about why you should vote for Joe Biden, right? They don't understand it, right? They've never been in revolutionary groups. They've never been in activist organizations. So Marx is not something they can really understand. They've been told to be Marxists because the right wing hates Marxism and is always calling everyone a socialist, and the right wing is who they're supposed to fight. And they've been subsidized and propped up by the establishment as the voices of Marxism, but they don't understand it, right? Marxism is an ideology that is inherently opposed to the power structure. What they're doing is they have a gig. They've got a gig defending the power structure. So they don't get it. And they're not involved in any activism. They haven't been in socialist groups. They haven't engaged in revolutionary organizing. They have no idea about it, right? And they think it means worker cooperatives. They try to explain like the formulas M plus C plus M or what. I mean, they don't get it. They don't get it, right? They really don't get it, because in order to really get it, you have to be living it. You have to live a life of struggle. And once you start living a revolutionary life, and once you join revolutionary organizations, and once you give your life to being an organizer, you don't have to give your whole life. Obviously, people have jobs and wives and kids and families. But when you are involved in the struggle, it'll make sense to you. It'll make a lot more sense to you. You'll get a lot more out of it. And Jason makes me want to go crack open the German ideology and see how it strikes me now. But there you go.